Oops. Share the text. And there we are. Hopefully that's working fine. Don't see any reason to doubt it. And there we are. But you never know. You never know how the system is working. That's good. All right, just let me line up a few of my windows and make sure it's all going fine. Okay. Let's give it a second until we've let people log in. Might have even worked a little faster than usual today, so have to account for that. All right, well, we're at the 12:01 mark. That's our usual tipping point for getting people logged in. And so now we can begin. So we are going to pick up in Parashat Terumah. We're going to look at the beginning of it, but much of the concepts that we're going to be looking at today are actually relevant to the entirety of not only Terumah, but all of the Parshiot dealing with the construction of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle. And that's because that construction is, well, something that is, well, kind of revolutionary. It is also both incredibly prosaic in the sense that religious items and places of worship had been made, well, about as far back as we can find in archaeology. Some of the earliest artifacts that have ever been uncovered appear to be religious in nature. It's hard to say for sure because, well, people who made them are not still around, not even their cultures. But it does seem to be an instinctual part of humanity to make things that are connected to their spiritual life. And Parashat Terumah and all of the subsequent Parshiot which deal with it are certainly going to exemplify that, as will, to a more negative sense, the making of the golden calf, which is also part of that upwelling of the human spirit, just directed very, very poorly. So we need to look at the direction that is here in Terumah, the way that God is telling us to put our hands to the task, to see what's going on. Since we know that people are going to want to make, what is it and why is it that God is going to tell us to make the things that we will make? So that's going to be our focus. And we'll look at one area in particular, but please take it as being a sort of entry point into thinking and learning about the entirety of the construction. So let's dive in. We're going to begin right here at chapter 25, verse 1. Now Adonai spoke to Moshe, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, that they may take me a raised contribution from every man whose heart makes him willing. You are to take my contribution. So we're doing this truma, this contribution, and it is something that is happening because of the lev, because of the heart of those that want. This is not a tax. There are taxes in Torah. This is not. This is a voluntary donation. And this is the contribution you are to take from them, meaning that while it is voluntary, we have requirements for the Mishkan that if somebody is donating for it, this is the list that needs to be filled. Gold, silver, and bronze, blue, violet, purple, and worm scarlet yarn, byssus and goat hair, ram skins dyed red, tanned leather skins, acacia wood, oil for lighting, spices for oil, of anointing, and for fragrant incense, onyx stones, stones for setting for the ephod and for the breastpiece. So these are the stones that would be affixed later onto the cloth breastpiece that was worn by the Kohen Gadol. So that's the shopping list, if you will. But what are we going to do with this? Let them make me a holy shrine that I may dwell amidst them, or among them, as many translations put it into slightly easier English. And this is a very, very famous line used in the inauguration of many, many congregations, that we make a place that is sanctified, and as a result, God comes and dwells not in it, but among us. That this is not building a box for God. This is instead building a sanctified place that allows us to perceive God's presence. It is not it's not God's house in the literal sense of the word, because God cannot be contained in any dwelling. But this is a place that, when built, does allow us to have a connection to God that we would otherwise miss if the building weren't there. And then we get a little bit more precision here, and honestly, a bit of a warning. Exactly as I grant you to see the building pattern of the dwelling and the building pattern of all of its implements, thus are you to make it. So verse 9 comes at the conclusion of this first section to say, yes, I want you to build this Mishkan, I want you to use these materials, and you will use a particular blueprint. There will be a design, a pattern, if you will, that you will have to follow in order to properly fulfill this. Now, again, in the modern world, that may seem obvious, but in the ancient world, why can't I just build whatever I feel like? I'm building it for this sanctified purpose. I'm building it to feel connected to God. Surely I should be the architect of this building, not God. No offense to God, but I am building it in order that I can feel close to God. God does not need it to feel close to me, because, God, but that means I should build it according to my needs, rather than according to a separate blueprint. But of course, there is an underlying concern throughout Judaism of how we express our connection to the divine in the material world, that our physical representations are, well, fraught with peril. We saw this back in the Aseret HaDibrot, the Ten Commandments, where we are forbidden to make images of things in the heaven and earth and other things that are around us, that we are not allowed to use them as part of our worship at all. And that is for very good reason. Using material objects as part of worship is a step towards idolatry. On the other hand, well, we are building material objects. So how do we keep that straight? Well, the short answer is by following the directions. The long answer is going to be part of our discussion in our commentary, so I'll leave it for more detail till we get there. But let's look at the first object being described. As many would point out, really the most important thing, the Aron HaKodesh, the literal Ark of the Covenant of Raiders of the Lost Ark fame, but it was famous even before that, and this is its description. They are to make a coffer, or a container, of acacia wood, 2 cubits and a half in length, a cubit and a half in width, and a cubit and a half in height. There is some variation in how we define a cubit. Generally speaking, if you translate it to be about 18 inches, you'll be in the ballpark of its sizing. So if something is a cubit long, it's about 18 inches long, If something is 2 cubits long, then it's about 3 feet long. Just use that and you'll get a base rough idea. It might be a few inches more or a few inches less in reality, but we do the best we can with the sources that we have. You are to overlay it with pure gold. Inside and outside you are to overlay it, and are to make upon it a rim of gold all around. You are to cast for it 4 rings of gold, and are to put them upon its 4 feet, with 2 rings on its one flank and 2 rings on its second flank. So we've got this box, and it's got these extra rings on its side, and you are to make poles of acacia wood and are to overlay them with gold, and are to bring the poles into the rings on the flanks of the coffer to carry the coffer by means of them. So the ark is carried very famously on the poles, not just, lifting it like you would a sofa. And this is its mode of transportation. In the rings of the coffer are the poles to remain. They are not to be removed from it, meaning that they are considered an integral part of it, and they stay there. And you are to put in the coffer the testimony that I give you. We've had other classes about what was in the Aron. This edut is usually associated with the Aseret Dibrot, or the statement of the Brit, the covenant in general, that was discussed in the revelation at Sinai. You are to make a purgation covering. All right, so the word purgation cover probably doesn't exactly help us if you don't know the Hebrew, but the Hebrew is also a little tricky. Kaporet is the word that's being translated here. And of course, the word is also in the root of the word Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. So this kaporet is talking about a form of expiation, of how we are atoned, how we are cleansed, how we are removed from our sins. And in this case, we're not going to go into much detail, but just to help you a little bit, we're talking about this cover as being a particular focal point that aids with the process of atonement, of continually reconciling our relationship with God so that it can maintain its good status. That's enough for today. Obviously, there's much more to be said about it, but we've got more to talk about. You are to make this purgation cover of pure gold, 2 cubits and a half its length and 1 cubit and a half its width. So this is our lid to the Aron HaKodesh. You are to make 2 winged sphinxes of gold. Of hammered work are you to make them at the 2 ends of the purgation cover. Make 1 sphinx at the end here and 1 sphinx at the end here. From the purgation cover, you are to make the 2 sphinxes at its 2 ends. All right, so first of all, you might be a little surprised to hear the term winged sphinx showing up in Torah. And, that's perfectly fair. It is not a normal translation. As we'll talk about in our commentary in much more detail, this is Everett Fox's attempt to translate the word keruvim. Keruvim is translated into English normally as a cherub. The problem, of course, as we'll talk about, is that the word cherub elicits certain images in our mind, which may or may not be connected to what actually was on the ark. As we can see here, as well as JPS discussion, these creatures on the top of the ark may not bear the same resemblance to a cherub that we think of thanks to Renaissance paintings and other such cultural aspects in our general cultural setting. So we will come back to exactly what these cherubs are, but for the moment, just hold open in your mind what they might be. Try not to lock them in based off images you have seen from movies or books, or based upon just the word cherub, which, like I said, has a whole host of associations which may or may not, we're going to leave that open, have a connection to what the creatures on the top of the ark actually looked like. Now, the other detail, of course, is that we have 2 of them, and they are on each end of the of this aron, of this ark. And carrying on in verse 20, and the sphinxes are to be spreading their wings upward, with their wings sheltering the purgation cover, their faces, each one toward the other. Toward the purgation cover are the sphinxes' faces to be. So we have these 2 creatures. They have wings. Their wings are spread out so that they provide some form of cover over the top of the ark cover. And their faces, well, they are facing towards each other, but also downwards. That is to say that they are pointing towards the ark itself through the lid, if you will. So that is the description that we get of these keruvim and exactly how they are to be oriented on the top of the ark. We're going to dive into why we have these creatures, why we have these cherubs, and what they are intended to represent, and how we can even get away with having them, since it seems like that looks an awful lot like what I might call an idol. So we're going to dive into that in just a second. But as always, while I take a quick sip of tea, if anybody has an additional comment or question on the other aspects of this reading, feel free to unmute or type it away in chat. Okay, so let's find out what we're dealing with here. So first of all, we're going to look at this commentary from JPS. The Jewish Publication Service is the service that has done a great deal of work in trying to bring many books to people in the modern world. And their scholarship and research is wonderful and based on a lot of modern research as well as traditional commentary. And they were the first to try and introduce this idea of winged sphinxes because, well, as they put it, others might call it cherubim, which, however, is too reminiscent of chubby-cheeked babies and angels in Western art. That, quite frankly, the word cherub now has a meaning in English which does not necessarily reflect anything in Judaism or the cultural setting from which the early Israelites would have found themselves. I would love to hear an art history version of how we got from one to the other. I've got a few hints, but I've never seen anybody do a proper academic study. And we'll talk a little bit about how it might have happened. But in Mesopotamian tables, JPS points out, these mythical figures, that is to say, things that were named akin to a cherub, are sculptured, served as guardians. So too at the end of the Garden of Eden story. That is to say, if you read Genesis 3 after the expulsion, you'll find that God put a cherub at the gate to Garden of Eden with the flaming sword. So clearly that is not just a pudgy, cute baby. That is something that is meant to be fierce. And when we look in the archaeology of other Near Eastern cultures, which had creatures that were similarly named, we find that they looked more like what we would call a sphinx. You can see some of these on display in the British Museum's collection, as well as other museums around the world. So that seems to be more likely what we are dealing with here. However, if we look into Jewish tradition of how we have interpreted this, that was not drawing from archaeology, because archaeology is a much more modern research tool, because we simply did not have a systematic examination of the past in order to draw any inferences. If we look at Rashi, we see that, in fact, these cherubs had the form of a child's face. So wait a minute. I thought we weren't going to use the word cherub because it sounded too much like chubby-cheeked babies. But then Rashi tells us that they are baby-faced. Well, wait a minute. What's going on? And by the way, this is probably, but again, I can't swear to it because I haven't done the research myself nor read it from anyone else. This is probably where Western art got the idea. There are many influences from Jewish tradition and Jewish teachings in Christian representation, even if they don't always explicitly say that. There's also many representations in Christian art that are due to a lack of examining Jewish sources or asking us questions. But we get an interesting mix. And this may be one of the places where the chubby cherubs come from, because Rashi says they have children's faces. And then the artists ran with it. Now, why would Rashi say that? Well, like most of Rashi's comments, he is not making it on his own. He is drawing from an earlier tradition, going all the way back to the Talmud in Sukkah, 5b. And what is the form of the face of a cherub, or keruv in Hebrew? Rabbi Abahu said, like that of a child, kiravya, as in Babylonia, one calls a child ravya. So interestingly enough, this is a very early form of what many modern academic linguistic scholars will do, which is to say they'll look at a word which is difficult to translate or understand, and they will try to find a similar version of that word in a neighboring language. It'd be like trying to find out what a word in French meant by looking at a word in Spanish. They're both Romance languages. They have many similarities. It's not going to be a one-to-one correlation, but if you've got nothing else to look at, sometimes the Spanish may help you figure out your mystery word from the French. Well, Aramaic and Hebrew are similar. They are, in fact, very close in many ways. They're also very different in many ways. And Rabbi Abahu is making a very modern claim, which is to say, well, in Aramaic, we have this word ravya, which can mean child. Well, if it is a keravya, keruv, keravya, then it is like a child, because the word, the letter kuf, kaf at the top of the word, the front of the word, is a indication of comparison, as in the phrase "mi kamocha," right? Who is like you? It is that comparison word. So it is like a child. Therefore, the cherubim must have had childlike faces, and that is what Rashi runs with. Now, is that the only way to read it? Well, obviously not, because if we dive into Ibn Ezra, we get a more exhaustive examination of this question. Our sages said that the cherubim looked like two youths. He's referring back to our section in the Talmud there. Now, if they had a tradition that the cherubim were youth-like images, then what they said was true. The long-standing position in Jewish analysis is if somebody says this is a received tradition, not that I'm just figuring it out on my own, but I was told that my teacher was told that he was told that he was told that he was told all the way back to the original, then that is a good thing to base it off of. And they interpreted the word in a manner that would recall that tradition, meaning that they had a tradition that they looked like babies. And then when they wanted to point out a way to remember that, they looked at the almost mnemonic of comparing it to the Aramaic word that we just saw. So what Ibn Ezra is saying is that if they actually had this tradition, then that's a reliable thing. And we shouldn't take Abahu's interpretation as being his own attempt to figure it out. It's just a handy way to remember what the tradition taught, which is they are baby-faced or child-faced. Now, he is going to reject that, but he is holding open the possibility. But ultimately, as we'll see, he's really rejecting that because he will argue the kaf in the word keruv is a root letter, right? It is not a word or a letter attached as a prefix to serve as the word like. It is instead an actual part of the word, as in the word ha-keruvim and in the word kerubim shall, right? Because in both those places, we're not saying the like children, we are saying the cherubim. And we're not able to interpret the kaf in any of those places as being a prefix. It is part of the root. The hey, the ha in that phrase of ha-keruvim indicates a definite article. It is not an interrogative hey. Sometimes hey at the start of a word can be a question indicator, like in the hey in ha-kimakat, which is, or is he slain according to the slaughter of them that were slain by him. So we can't argue that kaf and the word keruvim is actually part of a prefix. It is not an interrogative hey, which would allow maybe it to be open, but instead it has to be an actual part of the word. Now, I have searched for the meaning of the word keruvim, because if we're not interpreting this to mean that they have young faces, then what does it mean? And I have found that it refers to various forms. Compare, thou wast the far-covering cherub from Ezekiel, and Ezekiel said that each one of the beasts that he beheld had 4 faces. One of the faces was the face of an ox. However, elsewhere, he describes this very creature as having the face of a cherub in place of the face of the ox, meaning there's a difference between his description in chapter 1 and chapter 10. Its meaning is that the creature had the image that Ezekiel had mentioned earlier. At the end, Ezekiel says, "This is the living creature that I saw under the God of Israel by the river of Chebar, and I knew that they were cherubim." Ezekiel thus called the 4 creatures, meaning all 4 of the faces that he saw, cherubim. The kaf in the word cherubim thus is a root letter. So Ibn Ezra is trying to make it clear to us that we can't just say that it is a cute little word play. It is like a young person. Because of the grammar of the usage of the word in other places, and because of the way Ezekiel uses this word, and he uses it more than most, we have to say that all the letters are part of the root, meaning that it's a separate, distinct thing, and we can't argue that it looks like a young person. Instead, we have to argue that it looks like, well, perhaps many things, because it could be an ox, or it could be something else, because the term seems to be a little slippery. The term seems to be a broader range of potential shape than just one fixed item. At least that seems to be where we are so far with Ibn Ezra. Let's take a look and see if Yoma can give us anything else to analyze here. This is back in the Talmud. Rav Katina said, when the Jewish people would ascend for one of the pilgrimage festivals, that is to say, Pesach, Shavuot, or Sukkot, the priests would roll up the curtain that would separate from the outside world all the way back to the Holy of Holies and show them the cherubs that were clinging to one another and say to them, see how you are beloved before God, like the love of a male and female. Make sure we get the picture here. That they would raise the curtain that normally would separate the Holy of Holies from the rest of the, not just the temple, but if you were looking through the front door from the gateway, you'd be able to see all the way down and see the ark there. And you could see that there were these two cherubim, and not only were they humanistic in different genders, that you had a male and female form, and they appeared to be in the form of an embrace. When invaders entered the sanctuary, that is to say, when Judaism was conquered, they saw the cherubs clinging to one another. They took them out to the market, meaning they're publicly desecrating and humiliating, and said, these Jews, whose blessing is a blessing and whose curse is a curse, they be occupied with such matters. Basically, they brought this out and they held it up as though it was a form of erotic art, and are mocking us because how debased are we that we had these embracing angels of some construction on the top of our ark. And they immediately, meaning the non-Jews, debased and destroyed them. And as it is stated, all who honored her debase her because they have seen her nakedness, taken from the Book of Lamentations, which describes the destruction during the Babylonian attack. So Yoma is trying to hint again that we are actually still seeing something on the top of this ark that, while it may be fluid in Ezekiel's visions, would have had to have had a physical form. And they're arguing that that physical form was human enough that you could tell male and female, and human enough that their embrace would be meaningful, would be significant to those that were looking at it. Now, you'll notice that our interpretation of that embrace was not meant as a form of erotic art. This was not just a sexy statue, but the intent of this was to make us realize that we were as beloved to God as a husband and wife are to each other. And so there was a reminder of that relationship. We're going to come back to this purpose of the angels in more detail, but we want to also look a little bit more on this underlying question of how we made them in the first place. So Chizkuni gives a great summary of this topic. So first of all, like most, he has to duck in to try and explain what these cherubim were. Like a cherub with outstretched wings, they are a certain type of bird, meaning that he sees these cherubim as being more bird-like than any other animal, seeing that birds are both clean animals. Most species of birds are kosher and move in a clean atmosphere. They're not wallowing around in filth most of the time. Even in the Torah, and so he's looking at these as being more bird-like. But the second half is the real compelling topic that we need to cover for today, because as he points out, even in the Torah, we find exceptions to overriding commands. What is he talking about? Well, for example, anyone who performs forbidden work on Shabbat is guilty of legal execution. All right, yes, we know that, but priests performed such work in the temple every Shabbat when offering the daily communal sacrifices. So we know that if you work on Shabbat and under the right evidentiary settings, a person could be executed for doing so. And yet we see that the priests are commanded to do work on Shabbat that, well, if it weren't them, would get a person executed. So it seems that the Torah has already an understanding that there will be exceptions to different commandments, and that those exceptions are going to be purposeful rather than accidental. And this is the first example that he's given us. Not only that, though, even individuals, meaning that it's not just the priests that get special dispensation, but even just regular people, well, when becoming fathers of a boy, baby, born on Shabbat, circumcised him on the following Shabbat. So we know that Brit Milah, the act of circumcision, takes precedent even over Shabbat, which means that while you would normally be guilty of Shabbat violation for doing the actions needed for Brit Milah on any other day, on any other Shabbat, if it is the 8th day after that baby was born, then not only are you not guilty, you are obligated to perform those actions. Likewise, the Torah strictly forbade marrying the wife of a brother, not allowed at all, but made an exception if said brother had died without children, and encouraged a surviving brother to marry the widow who had been his brother's wife in order to provide him with issue. Similar exceptions are in place for wearing wool garments with tzitzit, meaning a blending of different fabrics, including wool and linen. So there is a range of things in Torah that make us scratch our head and say, but I thought that was prohibited. But that is exactly the point, that we should not be startled that the Torah is not a perfectly intuitively consistent document, but instead represents the fact that there are going to be many needs within a community, whether it be weddings and births or whether it be sacrifices, that will sometimes, under certain circumstances, be of a higher order of magnitude than other general principles. Not something we just willy-nilly do, and we don't make that decision on our own. We do it through study of our tradition and analysis of Jewish law, but we shouldn't be surprised when we find those exceptions. And of course, what is one of the chief exceptions? The making of images that are very much, well, in any other context, idolatrous. If I were to set up images of cheruvim of some description and put them in a place that was a focal point of worship, I would be violating the commandment not to create idols, and I would be very guilty, very straightforward. And yet here, only a few short chapters after Aseret HaDibrot, the Ten Commandments, prohibited that action, God is telling us to make these angels and put them up. Now, what do we do with that? Well, the first thing we do is we say, okay, right? God is allowed to make exceptions to God's own rules because, well, he's God. And that is perfectly harmonious with our understanding of God. But Judaism always tells us that while it is true that na'aseh, we will do, but also nishma, we will understand. And meaning that there is a purpose, there is some deeper meaning behind the need to have these cheruvim on the top of the aron, on the ark. If there wasn't a reason, then God wouldn't have told us to put them there. God didn't put them there just because he thought they looked cute. He told us to put them there for a reason. So it is then up to us to try and attempt to understand that reason. So with that in mind, we will go to one of the best reasoners out there, which is Rambam. Rambam, also known as Maimonides, wrote many books, but one that we'll be drawing from today is Moreh Nevochim, in English known as the Guide for the Perplexed, where he tries to help us untangle many of the things that can sometimes cause a thinking person to be a little confused. And remember, being a thinking person is a good thing in Judaism. It is not something to be ashamed of. Naturally, the fundamental belief in prophecy precedes the belief in the law. For without the belief in prophecy, there can be no belief in the law. This is also reflected in the formulation of his 13 principles that is eventually put into the poem form of Yigdal. We believe in prophecy, and then we believe in Torah. And that order is important, he argues, because if we don't believe that God can communicate and does communicate with the world, then how could we believe that the text that we have is significant? It wouldn't be from God unless there is some method for God to bring it into the world. But a prophet only receives divine inspiration through the agency of an angel. So this is something which is perhaps a little bit more controversial, or at least not considered by most, that how does a prophet actually do the prophet's job? How does prophecy occur? And Rambam is arguing, with very good support from other Jewish sources, that this happens because there is a malach, there is an angel, a messenger that comes from God with the, well, message. For example, in Genesis 22 or 16, the angel of the Lord called, the angel of the Lord said to her, and other innumerable instances, meaning this is all over the place throughout the Torah, and also in to a lesser degree, also in other parts of the history, and to a greater degree in many of the parts of the prophets. Even Moses, our teacher, received his first prophecy through an angel. As we see in Exodus 3, and an angel of the Lord appeared to him in the flame of fire, in the whole burning bush episode. So in order to have prophecy, you need to have the angel. And in order to have law, you need to have prophecy. In order to have Torah, therefore, you need to have an angel. It is therefore clear that the belief in the existence of angels precedes the belief in prophecy, and the latter precedes the belief in the law. So we actually need to believe in angels first in order to believe in prophecy, in order to believe in Torah. So this is a critical hierarchy of belief, of foundation leading to the next level, to the next level, to the next level. Hopefully that's clear. Obviously, Rambam is not always writing in, well, he didn't write in modern English at all. He wrote in Arabic, but hopefully his 1,000-year-old document has been rendered somewhat intelligible in this form. Now, therefore, in order to firmly establish this creed, this understanding of needing angels to have prophecy, to have law, God commanded the Israelites to make over the ark the form of two angels. The belief in the existence of angels is thus inculcated into the minds of the people, and this belief is in importance next to the belief in God's existence. Why? It leads us to believe in prophecy and in the law, and opposes idolatry. So let's make sure we're following Rambam's logic here, because he is always trying to follow or build things up logically. He is saying that when God made the ark, in order that we could carry the record of the covenant between us and God, that God specifically put angels on top of it in order that we would actually think angels are real. Now, Rambam is very clear in other places that angels don't actually have a bodily existence that would have a shape, but we need to nonetheless inculcate a belief in angels, and for most people, that's going to mean having a physical representation. This is fraught with peril, as we're going to see in the rest of his analysis and other commentary, but it is essential to get something there to help push this belief, because this belief is so important. It is next to importance as the belief in God itself. Because without a belief in angels, we can't believe in prophecy, which means we can't believe in the law, and that then traps God beyond the reach of humanity, and humanity beyond the reach of God, in a way that might as well not have a God at all. Indeed, this was a position held by many philosophers throughout different parts of history, who believed there might have been some first cause, prime mover, or some other philosophical term for the deity, but they believed that the perfection of that entity was so great that it could not ever touch, influence, or be connected to us down here in the mud of the earth. Judaism, of course, disagrees and says, no, there is a conduit between God and in all of God's perfection and us, and that is called malachim. That is the forces that God has at God's disposal, known as angels. So having a belief that there can be this linkage, which we call angels, between us and God is essential. Otherwise, God becomes irrelevant to our life. And of course, the idea that there could even be a revelation of law would be an impossibility. So for that reason, says Rambam, putting these two angels right on top of the ark wasn't just a decorative feature, it was instructive. Now, Because there are some dangers here, he points out that the details give us some little protection. If there had only been one figure of a cherub, the people would have been misled and would have mistaken it for God's image, which was to be worshipped in the fashion of the heathen. This is indeed what other idol worshippers would do. You put just one image of a unearthly being, people are going to assume that's your God. And therefore, having two was a counterbalance to that. Or one might have assumed that the angel represented by the figure was also a deity. So there's God and then this guy. Neither of that would have been fine, and we would have adopted dualism, where we believe in two creatures, which is not an unusual earthly attempt at creating their own religious ideas. By making two cherubim and distinctly declaring the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, better known as the Shema, Adonai Echad, God is one and only one and alone in God's oneness, Moses clearly proclaimed the theory of the existence of a number of angels. He left no room for the error of considering those figures as deities, since God is one, and that he is the creator of the angels who are more than one. Again, let's try and unpack the logic here. If we have multiple angels, but we know that God is one, then therefore we can deduce the following. The angels aren't God, because there's two of them, and we said God is one. Additionally, the angels must have been made by God, because God is one, and they are many, therefore they have flowed from God's creation rather than their own innate divinity and existence. So by combining the Shema together with this double image of angels, the Torah is trying to create a visual representation that will do all of these different jobs, hopefully without too much of theological slippage, that we will believe that God is connected to the world through the gift of angels, which God created because God is one, and that's why there's two on the top, because that way we know it's not God. Now, that is still quite complicated, and I'd be willing to wager that many people still miss the point. And I would be willing further to wager that if we had the ark in the room today, there would be many people who would want to pray to the angel, even if they didn't want to call the angel God, even if they were willing to recognize that, they would still want to reach out to the angel, because after all, if the angel can be used by God to reach down to us to give us information in the form of prophecy, then perhaps they can take a message the other way that otherwise couldn't ascend because, well, I don't have such a high opinion of myself and my ability to talk to God. Unfortunately, there are many people, even without the ark, who still have that mistaken notion, not only within Judaism, but in many other faiths. It's one of the reasons why when we do Yukum Porkan, sorry, not Yukum Porkan, sorry, Be'ana Rachetz, the Aramaic passage immediately before taking the Torah out of the ark, we remind ourselves that it is to God that we are looking, and that the angels exist only as conduits, not as independent creatures able to do us favors. Okay, there's so much more to be said about that, but I want to make sure that we finish our other texts, and we can always loop back either together or individually as you wish. So we go back to this facing each other. What are we learning from this fact? This detail proves that the cherubs were not intended to be deities to be worshipped, else they would have faced their onlookers so that they could prostrate themselves in front of them. Right? That is the style of how idols were oriented in places of worship. They look out over the worshipers the way a king would look out over their subjects. And that way people could bow to them while they were facing them. They were facing each other to remove that as an issue. Seeing that they faced each other is clear proof that they had no interest in any onlooker, right? We are not worshiping them, and they are not looking to receive our worship. Furthermore, though their wings were pointing upwards, as we saw in the Torah, their faces were looking down at the lid, that is to say, the space from which God's words would emanate to Moses, and the area in which the Torah was kept. The most important proof that they were not meant to be worshipped by anyone is the fact that they were placed in a place that was inaccessible to the people on pain of death. Their function, therefore, was merely to be servants of God rather than God's competitors. Apart from that, the Talmud idea of opening the curtain a few times each year, 99% of the time, the Holy of Holies was kept completely sealed off, not just from the rest of us, but even from the Kohen Gadol, who would only go in on Yom Kippur. So this was not something that was set up in a clear, obvious, come worship me kind of location. Yes, earlier on, when when the ark was being moved from place to place and the Mishkan was being set up and taken down, the angels might be more visible at other times. But for most of their existence, these were not put up in a prominent worshipful place. And this is really underlying this tension that we want to remind people of the truths. As Rambam said, that not only does God exist, but God has a means of communicating to the world, and thus the law, which is represented by the ark, is true. But we also need to continue to shelter it in a way that keeps us from turning it into an object of veneration. We know from later on in the Torah that the people when they were attacked by snakes, would look to the bronze serpent that Moses erected, and we find out later on during the days of Hezekiah that this had become an object of worship, and so it had to be destroyed. So we know that people have slippery theologies, that they are easily tempted by these idols and statues, or even perfectly innocent objects into worship of the object rather than worship of God. So we see a tension back and forth of making sure the idea is there, but also making sure it doesn't become the object of worship. And then, of course, Rabbeinu Bachya will give us a nice summation of what we should be using when we think about this and what can still work for us in the modern world. This concept helps you understand how appropriate it was that the tablets were underneath the cherubs inside the ark. By facing the ark with their faces, as opposed to the wings, right? Wings up, faces down, the cherubs indicated that they looked for inspiration from the Torah below them inside the ark. If we really want to know how God is connected to us now, we look to the Torah. We don't look to the sky, and we don't look to hypothetical angels. That the Torah is the center of our connection to God, and it has been ever since Mount Sinai. And that truth is something that is still slippery in the modern world. There are many people who will venerate the object of the Torah, reach out to kiss it and feel great awe when it is being carried around the sanctuary, but who will do little to actually examine its content, to actually understand what the Torah wants from us as a representation of what God wants from us. That if I venerate the book more than the contents, that I must still be doing fine. And that is not the point. I don't think there are many people out there who worship the Torah, although I wouldn't be surprised if there were a few. But we do have to be worried and on guard that we sometimes will treat the objects of Judaism with more respect than what they are actually intended to do for us, whether it be treating the objects of like the Torah with respect while ignoring its content and its law, or whether it be treating a Kiddush cup or candlesticks or a challah board with great reverence, while forgetting the message of the candles of finding peace in the light of Shabbat, or the joy that comes from the Kiddush cup in Shabbat, or even just the abundance that is represented by the double portion of challah that we have on Shabbat. Sometimes we get caught up in the physical details and lose what those details were trying to teach us. That is our difficult place, because we are physical creatures. We are going to have physical objects in our lives. We're going to use them and need them for doing certain things, and they can be incredibly powerful reminders of deeper truths. But we have to work at it. It is way too easy to just slip into a worship or reverence of the object rather than what the object is doing or intending to teach us. So look around your homes, look around the sanctuary the next time you are there, take in all of the beautiful things that you are surrounded by, and indeed show them reverence and respect. But because of what they do in facilitating our relationship with God, and our performance of the mitzvot. That ultimately is the point. We'll leave it there for today. If anyone has any additional questions, you're welcome to ask them now or contact me at any time. All right. Take care, everyone, and have a wonderful day. And we look forward to the new month of Adar just coming up. And may it be indeed a month of joy for us and for all people.